Jerome King sat in his chambers, sipping his coffee and reading through the case files of James Butch Randall. He had been the prosecutor of numerous high-profile cases, but this one was different. The evidence was overwhelming, and he knew he had a good chance of getting a conviction. Butch was a symbol of hate and arrogance, and King was determined to bring him down. As he read through the files, King couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. Butch's lawyer, a slick and well-dressed man named Marcus, seemed to think he had a chance of winning. King had seen that look in his eyes before, a mixture of arrogance and confidence that often resulted in a defendant getting off scot-free. But King was not going to let that happen. He had a reputation for being one of the toughest prosecutors in the city, and he was determined to prove it. He made a mental note to review the security footage and eyewitness accounts again to make sure there were no loose ends. As he stood up to leave his chambers, King's phone buzzed with an incoming call. He looked at the screen and saw that it was his old friend, Alex, a detective with the police department. "What's up, Alex?" King asked, answering the call. "Not much, Jerome. Just wanted to let you know that we've been keeping an eye on Butch's associates. They're getting nervous, and we think they might try to make a move." King's eyes narrowed. "What kind of move?" "I don't know, but we've had reports of some of his people trying to intimidate witnesses and tamper with evidence. I think they're trying to get to you, Jerome." King's grip on the phone tightened. "Thanks, Alex. I'll be careful." As he hung up the phone, King couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He had a premonition that this case was going to be more complicated than he thought. Little did he know, the storm was just beginning to brew. The day of the trial finally arrived, and King was ready. He had spent hours preparing his opening statement, rehearsing his arguments, and making sure he had every shred of evidence covered. As he walked into the courtroom, he could feel a sense of anticipation in the air. The jury was seated, and the prosecutor's assistant, Sarah, was standing by his side. "Let's do this," King whispered to her as they approached the bench. The judge, a middle-aged man with a kind face, looked up from his notes and nodded at King. "Proceed with the trial, Mr. King." And with that, the battle began. King stood up, his eyes scanning the courtroom as he began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, today we gather to discuss a case that shocks the conscience. James Butch Randall, a man who thought he was above the law, has been accused of kidnapping and attempted murder of a young black teenager. The evidence will show that he and his associates hunted this boy like prey, and that he had no regard for human life." The courtroom was silent, the jurors and spectators hanging on King's every word. Butch sat in the defendant's chair, a smug smile on his face, his eyes never leaving King's. As King continued to speak, he couldn't help but notice Butch's lawyer, Marcus, watching him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. It was as if he knew a secret that King was about to uncover. But King was not intimidated. He had a plan, and he was going to see it through. The game was afoot, and the stakes were high. As King finished his opening statement, he locked eyes with Butch Randall, whose smug expression had begun to falter. It was a fleeting glimpse, but King could sense that beneath that facade of confidence, doubt was creeping in. The kind of doubt that only comes when someone realizes they might not be as untouchable as they once believed. "Your Honor," King said, turning back to the judge, "the prosecution calls its first witness." The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted as a young man named Marcus Walker was led to the stand. He was visibly nervous but determined. King had spent considerable time preparing Marcus, a witness who had been present during the horrific events of that night, and he knew this testimony could be pivotal. "Marcus," King began, his voice steady, "can you please describe what you saw on the evening of the alleged crime?" Marcus took a deep breath, glancing at Butch before speaking. "I was driving home when I saw a group of guys chasing a kid through the streets. It was clear they were after him. I didn't know what to do at first, but..." His voice shook, and he glanced toward the jury. "I saw them pull him from his car and drag him into an alley." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Butch's eyes narrowed, and King noticed a visible shift in the room's energy. The spectators leaned in, captivated by the sheer terror in Marcus's voice. They were laughing, Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength now. "It was like a game to them. I heard one of them say, 'Let's show him what real pain feels like.' And then I called 911, but before I could even get a response, I heard the gunshot. A heavy silence fell over the courtroom, and King seized the opportunity. "What did you witness after the gunshot?" Marcus's voice steadied as he recounted the chaos that ensued. "They were beating him. I saw Butch there, standing back, watching like it was entertainment. When the kid tried to fight back, they just got even more aggressive." Butch shifted in his seat, his legs tapping nervously against the floor, but King could sense the walls closing in around him. The evidence was mounting, and Butch's bravado was slowly eroding. King turned back to the jury, making eye contact with each member. "Thank you, Marcus. You've done well. This isn't just about what happened to that young man. It's about ensuring that no one thinks they can claim superiority over another life without consequences." As Marcus stepped down, King caught a glimpse of his mother in the audience, her expression a mix of pride and concern. He smiled reassuringly at her before returning his focus to the trial. But as the cross-examination began, the atmosphere shifted yet again. Butch's lawyer, Marcus, presented an entirely different narrative. "Isn't it true, Marcus, that you were driving with a friend who has a history of drug use? How reliable could your eyesight have been?" The questioning was slick, the defense aiming to create doubt in the jury's mind. But Marcus stood his ground. "I wasn't high, and I know what I saw. I called the police immediately." Butch's lawyer smirked, his confidence unwavering. "But you didn't stop to help, did you? You only watched, and then went home." King felt a surge of anger well up. The defense was trying to twist the narrative, but Marcus held firm. "I didn't know what to do. I was scared for my life. It wasn't safe." King could see that Marcus was struggling under the pressure, but he knew it was part of the plan. The courtroom erupted with murmurs, confusion woven into the crowd's reaction. Butch's chuckle echoed softly, a reminder of the confidence behind the facade. Once the cross-examination concluded, King stood to redirect. "So let me clarify something, Marcus. You thought you were outnumbered at that moment, correct? You felt your safety was at risk." "Yes," Marcus admitted, the tension easing as he regained some of his confidence. "And that experience still haunted you enough to come here today and testify, knowing how dangerous Mr. Randall and his associates could be." Marcus nodded, and the courtroom absorbed his brave defiance against the weight of Butch's presence. King turned back to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is a young man willing to stand up against a known threat. This case isn't just about facts. It's about risking lives to bring justice to those who think they are above it." He paused, letting his words sink in. Butch shifted again, glancing at his lawyer, who offered no solace. The defense was faltering, and in the shadows, King could sense the tide turning. But just as the momentum seemed to sway in their favor, the courtroom doors swung open abruptly. All heads turned as an unexpected figure strode in. Detective Alex, the one who had called King earlier that morning. The tension escalated, thickening the air, but King's heart raced with an unsettling sense of foreboding. "Apologies for the interruption, Your Honor," Alex declared, his face pale, "but we've just received some alarming news regarding Butch and his associates." King's instincts told him this was important. "What kind of news?" "There are reports of threats made against key witnesses. Butch's people are planning something dangerous that could potentially shift the course of this trial," he said, eyes glancing at Butch, whose smug demeanor had vanished, replaced by a flash of concern. Gasps echoed around the courtroom as King turned back to face Butch. The man once brimming with confidence now seemed to shrink before their eyes, the night shadows creeping closer. But before King could fully process the implications, he realized the very man who had believed himself untouchable now stood on the precipice of a reckoning. As Butch fidgeted, glancing nervously at his lawyer, the old bravado flickered like a candle in a gale. "No more games, Butch," King declared, his voice commanding. "The law isn't your playground. If you attempt to intimidate these witnesses, it will only seal your fate." The courtroom filled with a charged silence, and King leaned in, his voice low but fierce. "You may think you're above it all, but justice has a way of finding its targets. And today it begins with you." The tension was electric, and King could feel the shift in the courtroom's energy. The once sentient presence of Butch Randall began to crack, revealing the reality beneath that monstrous ego, fear. He sensed victory was near, but lurking beneath the surface were whispers of unresolved battles and impending dangers. It was clear this case was much more than a trial. It was a battle for justice itself, and everyone on both sides of that courtroom could feel it. And as King prepared for the next witness to take the stand, he steeled himself for what lay ahead. The fight was just beginning, and the stakes had never been higher. As the courtroom settled into a tense silence, Detective Alex took a seat in the gallery, his expression grave. King knew that everyone was watching him, waiting for him to steer this trial away from chaos and toward justice. "Your Honor," King addressed the judge, "given the alarming information we have just received, I request that protective measures be put in place for all key witnesses." He glanced at Marcus, who looked back at him with a mix of fear and determination. The judge, a veteran of the bench, nodded thoughtfully. "I'll instruct bailiffs to escort the witnesses safely to and from the courthouse. But we cannot allow any of this to derail the proceedings." "We'll continue, Mr. King." King breathed a sigh of relief. He knew that preserving the integrity of the trial would be critical. As the next witness was called, an elderly man named Mr. Harris, who had witnessed the traumatic event unfold, King stood with renewed purpose. He could see the fear in Marcus's eyes, mirrored by the anxious expressions of other potential witnesses. Butch's lawyer, Marcus, approached Mr. Harris with an air of insincerity. "Mr. Harris," he said, his voice coated with charm, "you are a man with a vivid imagination, aren't you? How can we trust your account of what happened?" Mr. Harris's eyes narrowed. "I call it as I see it. That boy didn't deserve what happened to him. And I saw Randall there, laughing while they beat him." "Laughing?" Marcus retorted, eyebrows raised mockingly. "This is serious business, sir. Are you sure you weren't mistaken about who was there?" But as Mr. Harris stood his ground, King stepped in. "Your Honor, I would like to remind the defense that integrity and truth run deeper than mere rhetoric. We are here to honor a young man's suffering, not to malign witnesses who display courage." Butch watched from his seat, his fingers tapping nervously against the cold metal of the armrests. King noticed the shift, a tremor in Butch's once unshakable facade. The walls were closing in around him. "Mr. Harris," King said, approaching the witness stand, "could you share with us the details of what you saw that night? Please explain the role Butch Randall played." "I saw him standing off to the side, enjoying the spectacle," Mr. Harris replied, resonance carrying strength through his age-weathered voice. "He had power over those boys, and it made him feel alive." Butch's fidgeting escalated. This was not how he envisioned his day in court. This was an awakening of his past, a public trial that stripped away the layers of his so-called authority. As the inquiry progressed, the prosecution presented text messages and social media posts from Butch and his associates, revealing their violent intent. Each confrontation with witnesses and evidence chipped away at the polished shield Butch had built. Halfway through the day, the atmosphere shifted again as King received a discreet message from Detective Alex. It read, "We need to talk after the trial. Things are getting complicated." With a nod, King returned his attention to the courtroom, where the jury leaned forward, captivated by the stark reality unfolding before them. The growing tension between the witnesses and Butch began to create an overwhelming sense that this man, who once held the courtroom in a vice grip of intimidation, was losing his hold. After Mr. Harris's testimony concluded, the courtroom was again left in stunned silence. King steeled himself for the next step, knowing fully well that they were walking a tightrope, and any misstep could send everything crashing down. "Your Honor, we would like to call our next witness, the victim of this brutal crime, Rashad Williams," King announced, heart racing at the thought of the young man facing his aggressors. A murmur flitted through the crowd. Rashad had avoided the courtroom so far, fearing the very presence of his attackers. But today, with the situation intensifying, it was his chance to reclaim his story. The door swung open, and a young man stepped into the courtroom, nervous but resolute. He'd been advised to take every safety precaution, and despite the shaky foundation beneath him, he walked forward with a strength that caught everyone off guard. But the moment Rashad locked eyes with Butch, the energy in the room shifted once more. Butch's bravado drained, as if his very essence was being siphoned away. Rashad's fear wasn't gone, but determination radiated from him, a glow that signified his desire to reclaim what had been taken from him. "Rashad, thank you for being here," King said, stepping closer. "Can you tell the court what happened on that night?" Rashad hesitated, glancing back once at the security detail standing watch. "I was just driving home. They were behind me the whole time. I was scared, but I didn't know that they were going to take things so far." The silence was heavy. King saw Butch's fingers clenching and unclenching, visibly rattled. "They pulled me out of my car," Rashad continued, his voice trembling but firm. "And I fought back." Just as the suspense reached its peak, the courtroom doors burst open again. This time, a group of Butch's associates rushed in, shouting wildly, seeking vengeance for what they saw as a threat to their leader. Before King or the guards could react, the room erupted into chaos. Panic surged as the members of the courtroom scattered, frantic attempts to flee filling the air with screams. Butch, who moments ago had seemed vulnerable and exposed, now bore a triumphant grin as if this was the lifeline he had been waiting for. He was no longer just an accused man. He was now the orchestrator of a shift, a calculated move intended to blend intimidation with chaos. "Get down," shouted Detective Alex as he moved to block the doorway, his instincts kicking into high gear. King's heart raced as he turned to Rashad, who appeared frozen in place, gripped by fear. "Rashad, we need to move," King yelled, reaching out to grab his arm. But just as they began to retreat, a shot rang out, echoing against the courtroom walls. Time seemed to freeze as eyes widened, breaths clogged in throats. The incident escalated into a whirlpool of violence, spilling into what was meant to be a sanctuary of justice. In that moment, King realized that they had crossed a line that would change everything. The sense of justice he had sought so fervently now teetered on the brink of becoming a battleground, and the fight for Rashad's truth had become a fight for survival itself. There would be no turning back now. The courtroom erupted into chaos, the sound of gunfire echoing like cracks of thunder within the once hallowed halls of justice. Shouts of panic filled the air as people dove for cover, scattering like autumn leaves in a storm. King's heart raced as he pulled Rashad down behind a nearby table, shielding him from view. "Stay low," King commanded, his adrenaline firing on all cylinders. He looked around, trying to assess the situation. Detective Alex had quickly moved to secure the door, shouting orders to the bailiffs and other officers who rushed in to restore order. But Butch, in his frenzy, was struggling to keep control over his associates, who were caught between panic and loyalty. Just moments ago, he had been grasping the threads of power. Now, he was losing it in the blink of an eye. "Rashad, remember why you're here," King whispered, looking into the young man's eyes. "You have to see this through. You are stronger than them. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about everyone they've bullied." Rashad nodded, determination igniting behind his fear. King could feel the weight of history pounding through his veins. The fight for justice, the battle against tyranny in whatever form it took. "Detective," King called out as he huddled low beside Rashad, "we need a plan to flush them out. If we can contain this quickly, we can turn it against them." Detective Alex nodded, his voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around them. "We need to evacuate civilians safely and call for backup. But we have to be careful not to escalate the situation further." In the midst of the chaos, Butch spotted King and Rashad. With a snarl, he called to his remaining associates, "Get rid of them. We can't let them take this from us." Panic surged again as shots rang out from Butch's group, shattering glass and ricocheting against the walls. Every heart in the room raced as guards returned fire, taking positions for better aim. "This ends here, Butch," King shouted, stealing his resolve. "You think you can intimidate people forever? You think this is a game?" The responses were wild shots fueled by desperation, their uncertain trajectory illuminating the courtroom like fireworks gone wrong. At that moment, Rashad caught King's eye, and it was as if an unspoken understanding passed between them. They were not just witnesses in a courtroom. They were warriors fighting against the oppressive silence that Butch had long wielded. With an unexpected surge of bravery, Rashad lifted his head, calling out to Butch with a voice unshaken by fear. "You're not a king. You're a coward. You've built your throne on the backs of others. But that ends today." The words were like a bullet that struck directly at Butch's core. It knocked the smugness from his expression, replacing it with something primal, something raw. In that moment, Detective Alex and his team moved. They stormed in, securing the exits and pushing back against Butch's groups with a relentless determination born from years on the force. The tides were turning, and everyone in that room felt it. The dark shadow of intimidation was giving way to the bright light of courage. King stood firm, emerging from behind the table as the chaos unfolded. "This is your last chance, Butch. You are surrounded, and you can't intimidate us anymore." Butch's bravado faltered, and for the first time, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. He took a step backward. "You think you can do this? We're untouchable." King shook his head. "We are stronger than you. Each and every voice you've tried to silence will rise against you. You're not above the law. You are at its mercy now." As if fueled by King's conviction, several of Butch's associates lowered their weapons, expressions shifting from blind loyalty to wavering resolve. They began to turn against him. Their faces reflected the awakening of conscience that had been buried within the fear King had seen permeate the courtroom for so long. Rashad remained by King's side, unwavering. Together, they stood at the forefront of an unyielding wave of strength. King could feel the momentum turning irrevocably in their favor. The power of truth was palpable. "You can't run from this, Butch," King yelled, his voice rising above the chaos. "You've terrorized this community long enough. Enough!" In one final push, the police surged forward, ensuring that Butch's men could no longer hide behind intimidation or chaos. The courtroom was filled with sounds of compliance, the handcuffs snapping shut, echoing like a gavel's final strike. Ultimately, Butch stood alone, surrounded by both law enforcement and newfound enemies. His once commanding demeanor crumbled into a mask of desperation. And as King saw the remnants of Butch's reign collapse into dust, he turned to Rashad. "It's over. You stood up for what was right, and you'll never have to fear them again." Tears of relief gleamed in Rashad's eyes, a mix of joy, pain, and a burgeoning hope. They had faced down the monster together, and with the support of countless voices finally united in truth, the trial became a transformative moment, not just for Rashad, but for every soul Butch had oppressed. As they stepped outside into the cool evening air, the weight of darkness seemed to lift. The community that gathered began to cheer, voices rising in unison, a powerful, harmonious declaration that justice would not be silenced. "Today, we reclaim our space," Rashad yelled, emotions spilling over. "Today, we take back the narrative they tried to write for us." With King at his side, Rashad felt a warm surge of hope for a brighter future, a future where no one could easily be pulled from their vehicles and no soul would suffer in silence. Together, they walked toward the dawn, knowing the true battle was just beginning, but this time they wouldn't fight alone. The strength of unity would carry them forward, illuminating every step they took against darkness, paving the way for a community reborn under the steady glow of justice.